Hi, everyone. I'm Mangino. You are listening to the Mangino Talks podcast with me, John Schalcosky, of the odd, mysterious, fascinating history of Pittsburgh. And in the last episode, we were talking about world firsts and, in a broad sense, the different categories. And there are a tremendous number of categories that we have world first here in Pittsburgh. Now, what we're not trying to say is that the absolute genesis is what took place here. But this is when you can actually make the declaration that it first happened here. There are clearly contributing factors of other individuals in other places that played roles, but we are getting to where you can actually call it the world first. Like we talked about in the previous episode, I said we go back to where it was first called a river. Clearly, there are little creeks and streams and tributaries that feed into it to where it becomes the river. But where do we first call it the river? And that's what we're doing here today with John Schalcosky. John, welcome. Always great to have you on.
Hey, thanks for being back.
Of course. Let's talk about sports. Mm-hmm. And there are not only records, but there are truly world firsts in sports that occurred here in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And let me go through some and just tell me whether it's a yes or no.
Sure.
Baseball?
Yes.
Football?
Yes.
Basketball?
Yes.
Hockey?
Yes.
Growing sport in popularity right now? Soccer?
That's right.
Boxing?
100%.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, I got you on this one.
Sure.
Bowling?
Yes.
That was a little too fast. Really? There's a bowling?
I only have one bowling fact for you. So I only have one bowling fact for you, and that was the American Bowling Championship in 1909 gave its very first gold medal to the very first person who was able to prove in person that they scored a perfect game in bowling. That event took place at a one-off competition at the Duquesne Garden in 1909 where a man did it. Got a 300, first time in public, and was given a gold medal by the ABC, bowling.
Yes.
Yeah, that event occurred in Pittsburgh. Now, the guy wasn't from Pittsburgh, but
it happened
occurred.
Here.
The event occurred in Pittsburgh. That's an example of one of these kind of world firsts.
Well, I can understand why it could happen here, even if it wasn't a guy from here, because we were talking in the previous episode. You go back to Pittsburgh history, and 150 years ago, 130 years ago, the city was one of the top 5-10 markets in the entire country.
Right.
So the idea of being able to hold these massive events that would draw people from everywhere to here makes complete sense.
Well, yeah, but then there's also another side to it where it was seeing how to formulate a popular sporting event and how to really draw a crowd from nothing to the biggest crowd you possibly could ever imagine pack a baseball stadium. That was a Pittsburgh thing. And that really is, when it comes to all these world firsts, really the underlying thing for sports world firsts is that there's something in the background, some kind of business people, a lot of them anonymous, to tell you the truth, people with money, people that were involved in other things in Pittsburgh, businesses and the city government even, who were secretly backing this idea of sporting events, knowing that these things have been going on since ancient times. Sporting events, it's always a popular thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do you pack a stadium now that's 1900? How do you fill the seats and make money off of this thing? And not just throw a game like in the backyard. How do I charge money, make money, promote money, pay people? How does that, all that stuff, the organization of sports as we know it, a lot of that has a Pittsburgh involvement. As crazy as it sounds.
And that aspect of it goes back to Pittsburgh.
Yes. So
that's interesting. You think about what the NFL is today and the marketing juggernaut that it is.
Yeah.
What the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NHL, all of these huge sporting events that are able to attract tens of thousands of attendees, not to mention the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who will watch a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
All goes back to these individuals here in Pittsburgh. That figured out a way of taking this sport that some people would watch people play out in the field and turn it into an event that people wanted to attend.
That's true. And I think that's Pittsburgh still has a little bit of a legacy like that. When they see something they like, someone sees something they like, it could be any business person alive today, and there's a few of them out there. I'm sure you know the names of the people in Pittsburgh who can make things happen if they chose to do it.
Right.
Those people existed like that back then, and they saw that in a unique time, place in history, where sporting events were kind of still in their amateur state after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, the idea of like team sports was like nobody. You had like maybe a few oddball sports, maybe skeet shooting or some very specific, not really big, highly publicized events. People were playing baseball. People were playing games where you catch a ball, but not anywhere close to how it is today. All that stuff comes from Pittsburgh. So I'll give you an example. Baseball, as long as there's been things to throw, people have been throwing them and catching them.
Right.
That's baseball, right?
Right.
With the exception of a few rules. Other than that, the game of just throwing something, it goes back as early as human beings. So the idea that baseball or some sort of thing like that began somewhere, there is no beginning to baseball. I mean, you got people who did the rules like Doubleday, but the games have been there since people have been alive.
Right.
So now what changes that from the fact that this game of throwing a ball around has been around forever to all of a sudden a world first? Things that occurred in baseball, the most significant fact was the first World Series. So now Pittsburgh as a team, as a professional, as an amateur kind of club team, was doing things for 20 years prior to the first World Series. Baseball, as it's formed today, was created after the Civil War, so it was still fairly a new game, even when they were playing, only 10, 15 years old, when they started just playing the concept of baseball. And then some guy had this vision, this thought, and he said, you know what? And it's like, there's all these teams around, they all, they have like their own leagues, and they compete very locally. But what if I put like my best team against the team from the other coast and see what happened? You think people would fill in the seats, and we could call it like some kind of national championship, like a World Series? So, and the team 1901, 1902, and 1903, the top team in the National League was the Pittsburgh Pirates. So they were the natural first pick to be in that game, and we lost. But the fact that we participated in that game makes the difference.
Yes.
That's what makes the world first. So the fact that the first World Series game ever played in front of another human being was played in Exposition Park in downtown Pittsburgh and in Boston.
And that
Pretty
name
big.
for the event is a great example of how you have these money people with a great business mind and tremendous marketing sense to call it the World Series.
Right.
And at the time, you're talking about baseball that didn't leave the country.
There's like 20 teams.
Yeah. A few
Yeah.
teams in a few states. It isn't clearly what it is today as an international league with the United States and Canada.
Right.
But then it was a small number of teams, but you make it big.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
next thing you know, people are interested in watching, and we love baseball. I mean, that was like the national pastime.
But you have, when it comes to World First, that was the biggest one for baseball, but there's many ones in baseball. For example, Bill Doak, who's going to be nominated for the Pirates Hall of Fame this year, he teamed up with Rawlings, like the sporting good company.
Yes.
Because he invented a new way to make a baseball glove, the way that's still used to this day, the modern day baseball glove. So invented by Bill Doak and Rawlings. Modern day baseball bats, the Louisville Slugger. The first person to ever have his name on a Louisville Slugger, Honest Wagner. He was the first person to ever use a Louisville Slugger bat.
Now, going back to the mitt, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that prior to the invention and the changing, there wasn't a web between the thumb and the pointer finger prior to his invention.
Yeah, it was like a giant oven mitt. It's the best way to put it. I mean, not even an oven mitt. It was like a giant winter glove, with some padding, like not even that much padding, to tell you the truth. I saw an interview with Honest Wagner where he talked about that fact, is how goofy it was for him to use one of these newfangled baseball gloves with all the padding and the webbing. It just wasn't used. So like sunglasses, the helmets in baseball, the first person to ever wear one was a Pittsburgh Pirate, so a helmet while batting. You'd think it would be a logical thing, but it wasn't. First person goalie in hockey for wear a face mask was also a Pittsburgher. Real quickly, first and only, one of my favorite world firsts, I'm sure most Pittsburghers, the first and only time a game has ended in a walk-off home run in Game 7 of a World Series was the 1960 Pirates, win. Never happened before, never happened since.
Right.
The first black African-American manager in a team, Babe Ruth's last home run as a human being, his last time he ever hit a home run out of a stadium was at Forbes Field. The longest home run ever on record, that was supposed to be Josh Gibson. The first person ever paid $1 million to play baseball, that was Dave Parker from the Pittsburgh Pirates. It was the first $1 million contract in all of sports.
Wow.
First person ever to steal home base twice. The person who holds the record for the most doubles, the person who holds the records for the most triples, the person who holds the most records for the most stolen home runs. These are all Pittsburgh, not only firsts, but last, and some of them are just considered world records,
Yes.
more so than firsts. However, things like that, walk-off home run, game number 7, that is a world first.
Yes.
And it's a world last. So now we move on, right, to, you had all of those sports. We'd mentioned bowling, right? We did have other big firsts in rowing and lacrosse and soccer and lots of other different things, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah, horse racing. Basketball is a fun one. Just months after the Naismith created the game, he started testing it out at different colleges around here. And he tested out New Brighton College in Beaver County. And they tried to see if this experimental new thing of shooting a putting a ball into a basket specifically, because people were again still throwing balls around, but the fact that there was rules,
Right.
they tried to test that out in this test market in New Brighton College, because it's considered the world's first college basketball game ever played between two colleges that occurred here in Western Pennsylvania. But that's baseball.
That's very cool.
Football, right? So everyone loves the Steelers, and everybody loves everything attached to the Steelers, right? But the Steelers wasn't where it all began. I mean, Steelers are just the team that's left over from all these other teams that came beforehand, including other professional teams like the Pittsburgh Stars. Nobody hears about them, but they were a professional team in the NFL. So anyways, prior to us losing our NFL franchise record and then Art Rooney buying it back in 1933. But does football have any kind of origin or world first? And it does. It not only does it, but it has one of the biggest. This is not the world's first Super Bowl, which would be pretty cool if we had the world's first series and the Super Bowl. We did have people, of course, born in Pittsburgh that were in that first Super Bowl, but and attached, I'm sure, everything that made the game happen, somehow had a Pittsburgh connection. But when it comes to the professionalism of sports, that's where Pittsburgh really takes the lead beyond any other city that's ever come before. Like we talked about earlier, people in Pittsburgh saw this kind of innovation and this way that they could promote and fill the seats. And they knew that if you had just a bunch of random college guys playing football in the backyard, it's fun to watch, but is it really that interesting? What if I could get, Wayne Gretzky to come play on my team or whatever, in this case, a football reference, what if you got Joe Montana to be your quarterback? Would you think more people would come see your game or less people?
Yeah. If you could have not only a bunch of people playing football, but if you could have one of the best that's known,
right,
that's playing football for another place,
right,
to come play for you.
Correct. Even better. And that's exactly what Pittsburgh did. And the guy has the best name. It's one of those names that I'll never forget, which is Pudge Hufflefinger. And his real name was William, to be fair. But
I am surprised that nobody else has ever named their child after him.
Yeah, well, good old Pudgy. But
or Huffy.
Yeah, exactly. But he was the best known college football player at the time at Yale University. And Pittsburgh, who had athletic clubs, no colleges at that time, but athletic clubs playing the sport of football against each other. So you had Allegheny playing against Pittsburgh, playing against Sheridan, playing against Westview, playing against West Deer, playing against Moon Township. It was just like kind of collegiate, interscholastic sports leagues. Nothing more than that. Not until some guy in Pittsburgh said, I know a guy who's the best college football player in the world. I think I'm going to try to pay him money to come here and play it for Pittsburgh. Well, that idea, that concept of paying someone to play a game, one of these types of sporting games, was a revolutionary idea. Prior to that, people, I'm sure, were paid some way, under the table, or everybody gets a free pizza dinner or whatever, you know. And, you know, that's technically considered payment, or everybody gets a little small award or a little trophy.
Yes.
You know, but not actually like $1 million contracts.
Yep.
Well, that changed with Pudge Heffelfinger. He was paid $500 to play one single game in Pittsburgh, and they won that game. But that document that exists and that concept is technically the birth of professional football, professionalized sporting events.
I mean, if I understand correctly, at this time, just so people can kind of put this in their mind, you were limited to have people who could play for you who lived in your community.
That's right.
It wasn't as though you were recruiting from all over the country.
Right.
So who you had available to you in the pool, kind of like how high school football is for the most part, where people who live in the school district, that's who makes up the team.
That's right. It's
So
exactly like that.
What happened with Pudge was he didn't live here, but we know about him. And how can we get him to come play?
Right.
Let's go out, seek him out, offer him a contract to get him to come here and play for us.
That's
the
right.
birth of professional football.
Right. Pretty impactful thing. And now the last thing I'll tell you about for sports, now well, I said before I get to the last thing, just some football firsts, the most consecutive football games with a sack. That was 75 consecutive games in a row. The Pittsburgh Steelers in 2021, believe it or not, that was the last time that happened. 75 games in a row with at least one sack. How incredible is that?
What's really incredible is I would have thought you would have said the 1970s.
Right, to 2021. Now, 1970s, 1975, the most rushing yards in the Super Bowl, the most touchdowns in the Super Bowl, all those types of things are the 70s, still in the record books for Pittsburgh things. Most wins by a rookie quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger. No one's ever done it since, right? Youngest quarterback to win a Super Bowl, Ben Roethlisberger.
Right.
Anyways, so those are some football things. Last thing, and something that nobody even knew was a world first, and that is hockey. Now, there was an inkling and an idea that something was going on in Pittsburgh during this same time period we're talking about, where it's kind of just interscholastic leagues and township versus townships, and nothing more than local players against playing other local players. All of a sudden, all these Canadians started showing up in Pittsburgh. And not just any Canadians, but the best known hockey players in the world at that time, people who won the Stanley Cup, were leaving Toronto and leaving Canada, where it was illegal to be paid to play hockey. It's considered purely an amateur alone sport. And same thing, some guy here in Pittsburgh, in fact, it was one of the people was Christopher McGee, who McGee Women's Hospital is named after, and he also was a political boss back in the day. He owned a bunch of railroad companies and things. He had the money, and he was the one that backed it all and came up with this idea of paying a guy a certain amount of money, and he would be able to give that and dictate that money out to a certain amount of teams. Each team could find a certain amount of players and pay him, X amount of dollars based on a budget, and literally created the first professional league in sports history, the Western Pennsylvania Hockey League. Now, this factoid seemingly went unnoticed somehow, in the public's eyes. And I don't know if it's because of the fact that not many people just clipped out the original newspaper articles and saved them, because that might have been the only way you could have learned that this was an ongoing issue for years in the news. I mean, hundreds of articles talking about Pittsburgh and in hockey and this whole professionalism thing. And yet, if you were to Google today, who was the first professional hockey team, you would see that it says somewhere in Michigan. So immediately.
And that was the case for what? 100 years?
100 years. So it's on the sign when you drive into the town in Michigan. It's on their sign, welcome to Michigan, birthplace of professional hockey. So how do you, once you find, so what I did is, through my research and just reading the old newspapers, which prior to 20 years ago, nobody really could do what I was doing. There was no easy way to search, and for every time the word hockey ever appeared in any newspaper in the world. You can do that now on newspapers.com. You can just type in the word hockey, read everything from the month of January 1902. Every single mention of the word hockey in every single newspaper in the world. And, if you
Because prior to this, we had microfilm. Right.
Yeah. Now, imagine if you had this goal in mind. I want to try to prove that hockey, well, number one, you have no idea what year it happened, what month it happened, what day it happened. And so you would have to go search and like almost reread the entire newspapers from
Right.
scratch, just looking for one mention. And then when you do find something about hockey, you could just talk about like, oh, hey, the hockey match is next week. Or here was a boring game and this is what happened during the game. So it's like, how do you filter through all that stuff to find what you're looking for?
Right.
A lot of it has to do with like madness and dedication to trying to actually and I did do that. I started January 1901 and I searched every newspaper in the world and I read every mention, whether it was benign or not, about the word hockey, just the word hockey, whether they're selling goods or whatever. And because of doing that due diligence of going through it all, and a lot of it you can tell pretty instantly that it's just going to be an ad or not, anything that, so you can kind of go through it quick. But did it every month of every year, from 1901, 1902, 1903, those 3 years. I read the papers all 3 years, every Canadian newspaper, every Michigan newspaper, every Pittsburgh newspaper, everything of the word hockey. And what I found was a completely new story, which was never told before, ever.
Well, it was told that one time.
Well, that's the thing.
In the paper.
Right. So that's the
And
weird
then
thing.
forgotten.
That's the weirdest thing about all these facts is that all of them are there. Every single thing I'm talking about is already there. It's just that for some reason they've been just lost and have to be rediscovered. Now, I don't know if that's like that for everything. It must be, I guess. But like, and a lot of it has to do with the technology aspect of it now that now for the first time in human history, we can go back so easily and find out and paint this new, like a new to us, but the actual story of what happened, of the birth of professionalism in sports.
Yes.
And this hockey one is fascinating because it is like when I made that claim, I say hockey didn't begin in Michigan, professional hockey. It began in Pittsburgh. I have the proof to back it up. And that's the thing. As long as you have the proof, which does exist, you have to do that. If I just made the claim,
Right.
like the guy in Michigan did, just made this claim in the 1950s is when the claim was made, and just no one ever questioned it. So, it's interesting to see what you can do. But that's
So this
a
claim
brief overview of sports.
Of research that you've done. And now you're saying that based upon your research that the birthplace of professional hockey is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Who's recognized that?
Recently, it was in a book where I mentioned it about the origin of Pittsburgh World Firsts in sports history, which is interesting. It's like a very hyper-local book. Believe it or not, a guy 2 years ago or so wrote a book about Houghton, Michigan, and called it literally the title of the book is Houghton, Michigan, the birthplace of professional hockey. And he acknowledges in there that there's somebody in Pittsburgh. He didn't mention names because there's a guy in Pittsburgh who claims he thinks it's just a bunch of fun. Like it's, we're just having fun with this idea of who's comes first. I'm like, it's not really, I'm just trying to be truthful.
That's all.
I'm not trying to take it personally.
Right.
That I completely ruined your story of the history of hockey in Michigan as you know it.
Yeah, you're not a fun killer.
Right.
You're just, dude.
Yeah. So,
here's what the article says, and this is the date.
Right. And I willingly and openly accept a challenge to try to prove me wrong. And if you can't, then that's the deal. But until you can do that, unfortunately, as it might seem.
Right. And it's
history
interesting to me, too, that there are many people that instead of upsetting the apple cart and being right, they would rather go along with their fairy tales.
Oh, yeah. 100%. That goes for everything in life. Isn't
that the truth?
It's fascinating in this day and age when you look at researching these world firsts and how you have to find out whether something's true or false, or if it's a rumor, or if it's just hearsay. And yet there's people that walk around their daily life that don't do that to the world they live in today, let alone 100 years ago, looking to the truth. Not looking to the truth today. It's pretty weird. Now, I'd say, what George Carlin had a famous saying, he loves people, but he hates crowds, So it's like, it's a matter of like that, really, the group mentality versus, you talk down to an individual, as well as anybody. everybody's an individual. No one's like in a group 100% type of thing.
Right.
You might be lumped into a thing.
Yes.
But, when you talk to somebody, they're individuals. They have, they're interesting in people. So it's just a matter of trying to debate the fact. I mean, there is no debate with the facts. That's the thing. So there's no debate about this Pittsburgh thing yet,
Right.
unless someone can prove it wrong. I've solved the debate. The final statement is in.
Yes.
It's submitted, and this is the end.
What I love about this argument is that nobody's arguing with you.
Correct.
The argument is this is the article
right.
that says
How
it.
do you yes?
Do you
how
have
argue,
one that predates this?
Right. How do you argue with black and white evidence? And that's what makes what I'm trying to do with these world firsts a little bit more unique, is the fact that no one's really ever done that. No one's ever really looked into any of these claims that deep. They just kind of like assume this is what the story is, but it doesn't really paint the full picture. So stay tuned, because there will be more to each and every one of these little things that I'm still digging into. I'm still finding out stuff. I have a photo of the 1903 World Series, that first World Series.
Mm-hmm.
On the field, during the play, there's African Americans on the field. Now, they might be ground crews. They might be trainers or something. But that's, news to me that black, African Americans were allowed on the field during the first World Series. I thought it didn't come around until Jackie Robinson. They weren't even allowed in the game. We weren't allowed, pass the field. Well, this totally changes everything I've ever thought.
There's some aspect of African Americans on the field, whatever role they played.
Yeah.
Maybe not on the team.
Sitting next to first base.
Wow.
Yes. One's in, it has to be, no one even knows the person's name, but he does appear in the 1903 group world photo of the Pittsburgh Pirates. And I think he must have been the trainer, but he's in the group photo. So it totally changes my outlook on, like, you think that just prior to Jackie Robinson, there was just this nothing.
Yes.
Like, no African Americans ever talked about or involved, and it was just like a separate league even. They weren't even ever, at least according to the photographic evidence, not true.
And when we're talking about sports, can we talk about sports and not bring up the significance of Negro League Baseball here in Pittsburgh?
It's fascinating too, and what I think the most fascinating thing I found out about this is all the stuff we're talking about is only like 100 years old. This wasn't an issue or something that people even talked about like 200 years ago. It was nothing. There was no concept of not involving one group or another when sporting events. You just played with your neighborhood, no questions asked. It wasn't until money came involved and the leagues came involved. And how that kind of shaped, and even in Pittsburgh, where they didn't see race more so than other cities, and that from we've talked about some of the these world firsts of African American things that happen in sports. It was like they just did not see the color barrier; they saw the person, and they saw how they could take advantage essentially of that person's skills and promote them to benefit all of us in Pittsburgh, and not just one group of Pittsburghers. It was like knowing the right person for the right job, and didn't really care who they were. And that's an underlying theme to most of these world firsts, is that there really wasn't some kind of thought really behind a lot of it, especially with that type of thing. It was just who are the best people for the job, put them in.
Yeah, like the first team to be completely fielded by people of color.
Right.
Pittsburgh Pirates.
That's right. Yeah, Pittsburgh Pirates. First,
all 9 starting players in a game.
Yeah,
people of color.
First African American baseball manager was for Pittsburgh. First African American football, person, the head office and on the field was Pittsburgh related. You got these kind of like revolutionary insights where it does seem to be about more of the person's skills and not about the color of their skin.
Am I recalling a story regarding Art Rooney and a football player that goes back to the
Lowell Perry was that guy's name.
Okay.
And he was the equipment manager and became the very first manager of the actual team when he was allowed on to the part of the team. But he was also, I can't remember the guy's name, but there was the other game where Art Rooney refused to play Louisiana or something like that because they didn't allow any kind of black people to play football. on their teams, like in Louisiana or something like that. But Art Rooney said, like, look, if you're not going to let my boys play, we're just not going to play.
That's it.
That's it. You know, and this is not college Art Rooney. This is the NFL Pittsburgh Steelers Art Rooney.
Right.
And
he stood on principle.
Right. And these things and struggles have been going on. I'm sure they went on in Pittsburgh even in the very beginning.
If you want to find out more about John Schalcosky and World First, make sure you follow him on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Odd Pittsburgh. Once again, John Schalcosky joining us, as he will be every other Friday. World First is what we're focusing on. And coming up in 2 weeks, the World First we'll be discussing.
Oh, it's going to be technology, innovation, medical frontiers.
I like it. John Schalcosky, once again, joining us on Mangino Talks. Mangino, thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.